my friends, allow us to cover this very important subject, for there is, tebel, confusion in the world today, about the am or nor, in the Hebrew meaning agreement, your firm regulation, and fixed support pertaining to one's faith, of the Great One, our Teshoah or Moreh, our only, Yeshua, salvation teacher, YaHuWah, HaMoshiach, our Messiah. Because many, Roah, evil, men have crept into our, core hall, assembly, and are now teaching their corrupted doctrines about the Torah, the law of our Father, YaHuWah, and his Son, YaHuWah. Amen. Now let us make this statement that covers it all, as we will be led by his Ruach Kodesh, Holy Spirit in our study today. Amen. We are neither Jew or Greek, Christian nor Messianic, for we walk, as he walked by his faith, in the Father, YaHuWah, and not by your own, for one has to duplicate his faith as he walked, and we shall walk in life, with the help of his Ruach Kodesh. For the Torah is our tutor that only leads us to HaMoshiach, the Messiah YaHuWah, and teaches about his true faith, which one who believes as he believed, his Mashiachim, meaning the anointed ones, belonging to the Messiah, his Talmidah, his true disciples that are more like him, as he teaches us, and by no one else. Amen. For the King James Bible is written in the corrupted Greek, and then translated into your English Bibles, states just the opposite as it is written, not by his faith in the Torah, meaning its law. For this reason, we are using the Aramaic translation, for better understanding as it was first spoken by HaMoshiach, YaHuWah, in our study today. Our Father's Torah is everlasting, for all generations, and YaHuWah said he came not to change the Torah meaning his Father's laws, but only the man-made, traditional laws, that were added. Amen. For example, as man created laws about one's morality, which YaHuWah corrected, and then gave to us on his sermons, one on the mount and the other at the seashore. Their ceremonial laws, and their blood ordinances, like circumcision, for both man and woman have to be circumcised in the heart, and not in the flesh. For these added laws by the Kenites only have enslaved us, and YaHuWah has only broken those chains, and sets us free from them, forever. Amen. The distinction between moral, civil, and ceremonial laws has been made by men's traditions over a lengthy period of time. It is clear that the Brit Chadashah, renewed covenant, frees us from some specific portions of the law, like dietary, temple worship, priesthood, and some holidays, not by simply getting rid of them, but by advancing them from their shadowy prefiguring, and into something better. HaMoshiach, the Messiah, is our new priest and only sacrifice, not by any other man and not by the blood of any animal no longer. The believer is now the new temple, and not by those buildings made by the hands of men, and eternal life our ultimate Sabbath, as we wait on him, on the 8th day. YaHuWah said that anyone who taught against even the smallest command is the least in his kingdom, in Matthew 5. Anyone who tries to overthrow the laws of Elohim, by calling them civil, and saying they are only for Jews is deceived, and his deceiver is by Satan. Most interesting is the fact that what they call civil law is very unclearly defined, because there is no scriptural definition. It seems like every time there is a new Supreme Court decision in the lands, the list of laws we don't have to follow anymore are only rewritten and changed behind our backs, and written much longer in their content. A law that is civil or ceremonial. What we call ordinances. Here, Paul writes, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his stake, written in Colossae. Colossians 2 verse 14. Now in the Aramaic, it reads. Verse 14, and by his mandate, he blotted out the handwriting of our sinful debts, which handwriting existed against us, and took it from the midst and affixed it to his stake. The word kub means both sin and debt in this case. It meant simultaneously. Now the word the shtar in this verse means handwriting, that is put on a bill. The results of all of this is certificate of debts. This cannot be Torah, therefore what they call a sinful debt is made up by man as written decrees, attached to the law. That is only in sinful act, in the eyes of YaHuWah, which he eliminated that action by man. Now this occurs 7 times in the renewed covenant and refers to man-made decrees. As the form of error at Colossus was largely Judaic, insisting on Jewish ceremonial law, this is not signifying the Torah of YaHuWah, but man-made decrees or ordinances. Paul was referring to the added law, which the Jews tacked on to our fathers' inspired word of his Torah. We find the Apostle Paul warning Titus of this added law. In the Aramaic English, it reads, and may not follow themselves into Jewish fables, and into the precepts of men that hate the truth. The men that hate the truth are the Kenites, the bad seed of Hasat-tun, written in Titus 1 verse 14. YaHuWah, our Father, was not always pleased with these added laws. YaHuWah chastised those who called themselves Jews in Matthew 15 and Marcos 8, for their commandments of men, which here meant eating with unwashed hands. The Kenites, calling themselves Jews, made many physical commandments, but they neglected the spiritual aspect of the Torah, and that is what displeased YaHuWah. Amen. Now ceremonial law, this type of law relates to Israel's worship. Vayikra, Leviticus 1, verse 1 to 13, the laws pointed forward to YaHuWah, HaMoshiach, the Messiah, and were no longer necessary after the death of the Messiah and his resurrection. Though we are no longer bound to them, the principles behind the ceremonial laws, that is to worship and love Elohim with all your heart, still apply. Now for their civil law is dictated to Israel's daily living in Devarim, Deuteronomy 24, verse 10 and 11. But modern society and its culture are so radically different that some of these guidelines cannot be followed specifically. The principles behind the commands are used to guide only one's conduct in society. Now for his moral law, the moral laws are direct commands of Elohim. A good example are the 10 Commandments, Shemoth, Exodus 20, verse 1 to 17. The moral laws reveal the nature and will of Elohim, that still apply to us today. We do not obey this moral law as a way to obtain salvation, but to live in ways pleasing to Elohim. Moral law. YaHuWah gave his own interpretation of the law in his Sermon on the Mount, but without the epistles, early believers only had the Old Covenant to follow, to deduce what part of commands of Elohim were part of our early training toward maturity, and what parts reflect the law of liberty in Romans 8 verse 2. For the Torah, of the Spirit of life, which is in YaHuWah, the Mashiach, has emancipated you from the instructions of sin and death. YaHuWah revelationary contribution to our understanding of Moses' law tells us that we are not to disregard it completely, but we need to discern which parts of the law were established for our upbringing, and which they would have to preserve in their new life with HaMoshiach, the Messiah. Amen. When YaHuWah said, "Do you know the commandments?" to the rich young ruler in Marcos, Mark 10, verse 19, "Do you know the commandments? Do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not kill, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother." He was likely talking about the 10 Commandments, or more broadly, the moral law of Moses. Even with our death in him, the Torah, the law is still our tutor to understanding. Romans 7, verse 4, our obligation to be like HaMoshiach, the Messiah, does not change. The prophet David says in Tehillim, Psalms 40, verse 6, burnt offering and sin offering you did not require, but this sounds contradictory since Elohim literally did require it in Moses' law. But not forever. This example is a good distinction between where Moses' law, and the law of liberty, separates. YaHuWah calls David a man after his own heart, probably in part because he saw the difference. Other verses like this exist. See Micah 6, verse 8. He has declared to you, O man, what is good, and what does YaHuWah require of you, but to do right, to love kindness, which is mercy, and to walk humbly with your Elohim. Amen. So, the moral law is made simplified about any of those commands that David said, you did not require. Most of these required laws, based on our David definition, have a broader law of liberty meaning, for hate is murder, in Matthew 5, verse 22, idolatry is covetousness. In Colossians 3 verse 5, but, as always, our Father's heart doesn't change at all. Now for ceremonial law, the letter to the Hebrews, especially chapter 9, reveals that much of Moses' law contained copies, or patterns of heavenly truths. Just as there is an altar in Moses' law, there is a version of that in heaven, from the priesthood, down to the altar and candles. These patterns given to us in Moses are shadows of the good things to come, Hebrews 10 verse 1, so they are similar to the moral laws in that they reveal a bigger truth. In this case, however, the truths they reveal are not mandates of holiness, but are only symbols of heavenly places. So the ceremonial law are any commands about which David could have said, you did not require, and were shadows of things to come, and were not primarily commands for civic functions. Not all these are in Hebrews, but it gives us a good starting point. Then civil law by process of elimination, we would say that these commands are those which do not adequately fit into any of these categories mentioned, but has called the Hebrew people to form a working society. In lieu of the judgment and reward of Elohim's people and enemies. Maybe, once again, this is never explicitly made known in the scriptures. For it's really hard to separate this category from the ceremonial law without adequately defining civil and ceremonial. Especially in a society where law and faith are never separated. Laws that talk about inheritance, land boundaries, and punishment for crime, might nicely fit here, but couldn't someone also say they point to shadows of things to come? The following exhibit the oneness of the law biblically, for whoever keeps the whole Torah, and yet fails in one aspect of it, is an enemy to the whole Torah. Jacob, James 2, verse 10. And yet Moshiach, the Messiah, has fulfilled the law. Now stating in Matthew 5 verse 7, the law is fulfilled in those that walk by the Spirit. Romans 8 verse 4, the law is fulfilled by loving each other. Galatians 5 verse 14, but the law was just a schoolmaster to bring us to faith in the Messiah. Yes, you have to go to school to be schooled in the Torah, but have you been to school lately? Do know the laws mentioned in the Torah as we just covered, my friends? By this they call attention to Galatians 3, verse 23 to 29, which we will read in the Greek as translated in your KJV, and in the Aramaic translation, where there are a number of key differences between the Greek and Aramaic, and this passage gives us a perfect example of why it is important to study these passages from the original Aramaic, rather than from their Greek translations that are full of errors, causing one to fall. Amen. Verse 23, but before faith came, we were kept under the law, shut up unto the faith which should afterwards be revealed. KJV. Verse 23, but before faith came, the Torah was guarding us, while we confined from the faith that was about to be revealed. Aramaic states the Torah is to guard us. Verse 24, wherefore the law was our schoolmaster, to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. KJV. Verse 24, therefore the Torah is a tutor for us, going towards the Mashiach, that we, by faith might be made righteous. Aramaic states the Torah is our tutor. Verse 25, but after that faith is come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. KJV. Verse 25, but since faith came, we are no longer under tutors. Aramaic uses tutors as plural. Verse 26, for ye are all the children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. KJV. Verse 26, for you are all the children of Elohim by faith in YaHuWah the Mashiach. Aramaic. Verse 27, for as many of you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. KJV. Verse 27, for those who have been immersed in the Mashiach, have been clothed with Mashiach. Aramaic. Verse 28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. KJV. Verse 28, there is neither Jew nor Aramean, nor slave nor free, nor male nor female, but you are all, Echad, one in YaHuWah the Mashiach. Aramaic. Verse 29, and if ye be Christ's, then are ye Abraham's seed, and heirs according to the promise. KJV. 29, and if you are of the Mashiach, then you are seed of Abraham, and inheritors by the promise. Aramaic. Now let us begin to compare some very important changes in the Greek, using the phrase, under the law in verse 23, where the original Aramaic actually reads the Torah is guarding us. Since not under the law was a false teaching that was never true, and not an obsolete Old Testament system, as some have wrongly taught, even today. The Greek also uses the phrase, no longer in verse 25, where the Aramaic simply reads not, which wrongly implies a change from the Old Covenant and Renewed Covenant, thus propagating the idea that under the law refers to the obsolete Old Covenant system, that has since changed. Finally, the Greek has the word schoolmaster, in the singular in verse 25, while in the Aramaic it is in the plural, in tutors. The Greek thus wrongly implies that schoolmaster that we are not under in verse 25 is the Torah, from verse 24, while in the Aramaic the singular tutor in verse 24, is being contrasted with the plural tutors, in verse 25. In this text the Torah is described as a tutor, or schoolmaster, that leads us to faith. This tutor, however, is not leading the world to faith, but leads individuals to his faith. We have always been justified by faith, even in Old Testament times. In fact, Paul himself, in Galatians derives this idea from the Habakkuk 2 verse 4, and Bereshith, Genesis 15 verse 6. The Torah leads an individual to Messiah and faith. This in no way implies, my friends, that the Torah should not be kept. For if you go to law school, and become a lawyer, can you then ignore everything that was taught by your professors, when you go on to practice law? Of course not. The fact that we learn from someone to attain a certain goal, does not mean that we can then cease to follow what we have learned. Notice that in the Aramaic, but not in the Greek as expressed in the KJV, we shift from tutor, verse 24, to tutors, verse 25, in the Greek they are both singular. In the Aramaic tutor, the Torah, which guards us, is being contrasted with being under tutors, paralleling the false not under the law theology, that is, proponents of the not under the law theology are trying to get you to exchange the Torah, as your tutor, singular, for them, as your tutors, plural. The Greek as expressed in the KJV misunderstands all of this by failing to render the plural in verse 25, and by using the phrase under the law in verse 23, where the Aramaic instead says that the Torah was guarding us. And finally by using the phrase we are no longer under, in the Greek as expressed in the KJV verse 25, wrongly implying that something has changed. We have never been under the law, and we were never meant to be under tutors, these not under the law teachers, but instead the Torah was meant to guard us from false teaching and be our tutor. The Torah is indeed a tutor, or schoolmaster, which guards us from the false teachings of other schoolmasters, such as those teaching the false not under the law theology, which was not an obsolete Old Testament system, but a false teaching that was never true. The Torah brings each of us as individuals to faith in Messiah, a faith that in itself will compel us to remain faithful to the teachings of our schoolmaster, the Torah. Satan wishes to steal and to kill and to destroy, Yohanan, John, 10 verse 10, and he knows the time is short and has stepped up his war with those who proclaim both Torah observance and faith in the Messiah. These are the two pillars of Nazarene Judaism. In the Book of Visions, Hatson, Revelations 12 verse 12 and 17, chapter 13 verse 7. But no weapon forged against us will prosper, YaHuWah, Isaiah 54, verse 17. These commandments of men, were the restrictive Pharisaical decrees, burdening their, Jews, and those among the Gentiles, who desired to worship Elohim. These human ordinances, additions by men, to what Elohim revealed in the Old Testament, contributed to feelings of prejudice, animosity, suspicion, and separation between the Jews and Gentiles, who were being called into the congregation of Elohim. These ordinances acted as a middle wall of division. However, YaHuWah abolished that barrier, through his supreme sacrifice, for he himself is our peace, Ephesians 2, verse 14, Amen. In Saul, Paul's day, many newly begotten believers, continued to suffer from the burden of their former teachings. Some converted Jews found it difficult to forget, and change that deeply ingrained part of their lives. It affected even someone as converted as the Apostle Kepha, Peter, c. Galatians 2, verse 11 and 12, where Paul explains to the Ephesians, mostly Gentiles, that believers comprise an entirely new community, that is not dependent at all upon the man-made laws and regulations of their former religions, but only upon what Elohim had revealed. Therefore you are neither strangers nor sojourners, but you are fellow citizens, with the set-apart believers, and of the household of Elohim. And you are built upon the foundations of the Shlichim, the sent ones, his apostles, for the Almighty has many agents, and the prophets, and YaHuWah, the Mashiach, has become the head of the corner in, the edictus. Ephesians 2, verse 19 and 20, Amen. HaMoshiach abolished the Talmudic traditions, all of which were yokes of servitude, bondage. For they bind heavy burdens on the shoulders of the sons of men, Galatians 5, verse 1, Matthew 23, verse 4, as necessary for salvation. YaHuWah, however, did not do away with any part of the law of Elohim. In fact, he made it possible for both Jew and Gentile to become spiritual Israelites, the children of Elohim, Galatians 3, verse 26 to 29, and chapter 6 verse 16, so they might live together in freedom within his perfect Torah, the law of liberty, by living in it, and not to be a hearer of something to be forgotten, but a doer of things, and will be blessed in his work, in YaHuWah, James 1, verse 25. He says in Matthew 5, verse 17, "Do not think that I came to loosen the Torah, or the prophets, but to fulfill them through proper means." The word loosen. The prophetic word, his inspired word YaHuWah gave to the prophets, cannot be loosed or annulled, and neither can the Torah of YaHuWah. These are two witnesses that stand as one. The word of YaHuWah is both Torah, instructions in righteousness, and prophecy declaring, foretelling and revealing the will of YaHuWah to each generation. The word fulfill is derived from the Aramaic mala, Hebrew mali, or the Greek pleroma. It means to fulfill, accomplish, carry out, or to bring to realization, to perform or do, as in a person's duty, or to obey or follow the commandments, as by satisfying the commandments by obeying them, Amen. Yes, to fulfill, to observe, to keep, and by doing so, he set us a perfect example as to how we ought to live. We are to walk according to his walking, 1 Yohanan, John, 2 verse 6. The Apostle Peter writes that YaHuWah left us his pattern that you should walk in his steps. 1 Peter, 2 verse 21, and Paul says, "I beg you, therefore, that you be like me," meaning faithful in the Father, and the ways in Mashiach. 1 Corinthians, 4 verse 16. The law of Elohim is good and for our benefit. You shall therefore keep his statutes and his commandments, which I command you today, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which YaHuWah, your Elohim, is giving you for all time. Devarim, Deuteronomy, 4 verse 40, Amen. Now how much Torah do the set-apart ones actually keep? There is a common lie being spread around by those evil church houses in the world today, that the law, being the Torah, is impossible to keep, which is mainly precipitated by ignorance of Torah. In reality, my friends, there are 613 MITZVOT, commandments in Torah. The majority of believers are keeping about 203 of YaHuWah's commandments. A much smaller minority are keeping as many as 275 of the commandments. However, 221 commandments are applicable only to the temple, and even if there were a temple, most of these would apply to Jews only, or persons living outside of Israel. These are not applicable to us any longer. An additional 74 of the commandments may not apply. These are special commandments which involve judges, agricultural matters, or are specifically for men or women, widows, etc. If we examine how much Torah that believers already keep, factoring in what doesn't apply to them, then we discover that the range is from 66 to 85% of Torah. Judge for yourself according to your own community, that do or do not observe each commandment. Also note that there are 94 commandments being observed by a set-apart group minority. The laws of the Nazarites are voluntary, therefore we could potentially include these 8 commandments into that category that may not apply, which brings the average up to 69 to 87% of Torah being observed. The 94 commandments, which fall into the category of being both a yes-no, are presently being observed depending on the individual believer. Obviously there is a very wide latitude of observance, and doctrines within the followers of YaHuWah. Can believers observe 100% of Torah that is applicable to them? Absolutely. Should they? Absolutely. In fact, HaMoshiach is the salvation of YaHuWah, who came to write Torah upon the hearts of his people, and to raise up the Kodeshim, his set-apart ones, Mashiachim, those belonging to him, a Talmidah, as true disciples that are more like him, YaHuWah, Amen. Now for a personal experience we want to share. At one time, a group of us were attending a Passover meal, and the Messianic rabbi said to the congregation that no one could sit at his table that was not circumcised, and sharing in YaHuWah's feast with them. This man certainly does not know about the Torah pertaining to the spirit of liberty that was taught by our Teshoah or Moreh, our only Yeshua salvation teacher, YaHuWah HaMoshiach, our Messiah. Because many evil men have crept into our core hall assembly, and are now teaching their corrupted doctrines about the Torah, the law of our Father, YaHuWah, and his Son, YaHuWah. Amen. This is very much like the apostles, that permitted circumcision at Jerusalem, an abrupt severance from the law not being practicable, but when they come to Antioch, they no longer continued this observance, but lived indiscriminately with the believing Gentiles, which thing Peter also was at that time doing. But when some came from Jerusalem who had heard the doctrine he delivered there, he no longer did so fearing to perplex them, but he changed his course, with two objects secretly in view, both to avoid offending those Jews, and to give Paul a reasonable pretext for rebuking him. For had he, having allowed circumcision when preaching at Jerusalem, changed his course at Antioch, his conduct would have appeared to those Jews to proceed from fear of Paul, and his disciples would have condemned his excess of pliancy. And this would have created no small offense, but in Paul, who was well acquainted with all the facts, his withdrawal would have raised no such suspicion, as knowing the intention with which he acted. Wherefore Paul rebukes, and Peter submits, that when the master is blamed, yet keeps silence, the disciples may more readily come over. Without this occurrence Paul's exhortation would have had little effect, but the occasion hereby afforded of delivering a severe reproof, impressed Peter's disciples with a more lively fear. Had Peter disputed Paul's sentence, he might justly have been blamed as upsetting the plan, but now that the one reproves and the other keeps silence, the Jewish party are filled with serious alarm, and this is why he used Peter so severely. Observe too Paul's careful choice of expressions, whereby he points out to the discerning, that he uses them in pursuance of the plan, and not from anger. In short, worked with Saul in solving what could have been a serious breach of the unity of the believers. As it was who had validated Saul's apostleship, the matter got a hearing and the promoters of circumcision were let off the hook. Got the public blame and no one had cause to feel resentment. Amen. Now my friends, our YaHuWah HaMoshiach did indeed do away with the unnecessary and unprofitable requirements of men. But the law of Elohim is binding on us more than ever. We are to keep it in the spirit as well as the letter. Even so, the benefits of keeping the laws of Elohim are wonderful and many. YaHuWah says, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Yohanan, John 13 verse 17, Amen. But for now at this time, as we come to the end of our Torah study for today, let us all say farewell, in his peace, that is everlasting my friends, till we meet once again, Amen. We are the congregation, and body of, Mashiachim, belonging to the Messiah, a Talmidah, a true disciple, that is more like him. We are the good figs that are on fire and love the truth of the true Elohim. Our burning bush. YaHuWah and his son, YaHuWah. Amen. Thank you for watching and studying along with us. From the congregation of Mashiachim, the true and only Messiah, YaHuWah. Amen.